Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth webinar of the UNESCO's series entitled New Perspectives on Collective Healing, Social Justice, and the Global Well-being. If you have participated in the previous webinars, welcome back. If this is the first time you're joining us, welcome. So the purpose of these webinars is to provide in-depth analysis of the need for collective healing following historical atrocities of all kinds, and to reflect on the ways that the communities, institutions, government, and people like ourselves might work together to address the legacies of dehumanization to ultimately enable the flourishing of all. So this series of webinars is co-convened by UNESCO Roots of Enslaved Peoples Project and the Global Humanity for Peace Institute at the University of Wales, Trinity St. David. My name is Chateau Gill. I'm the director of the Institute. I'm the convener and the moderator of these webinars. Now, today's program will focus on reparation. It's a timely topic. In particular, we will consider a number of significant milestones in the last 12 months in charting the ever-evolving global conversations around the topic. Now, let me just mention a few. I think beginning of last September, there is Accra Declaration on Reparation and Racial Healing. And following that, in October, there was University of Cambridge's conference entitled Envisioning Reparations, Historical and Comparative Approaches. And this was part of University Cambridge's inquiry into their legacy of involvement in the legacies of enslavement. Now then, beginning of January, the Church of England committed 100 million of funding to address the legacy of enslavement. And after that, you probably remember the Trevelyan family offered a public apology for enslaving Africans, and they also committed £100,000 to start a reparation fund. Now, after that, there's the owner of a Guardian UK newspaper. They also issued an apology for their founder's role in slavery, and they were expected to commit at least 10 million towards restorative justice. And now recently, the California's task force and their final report detailing the harms of slavery and their proposals for reparation. Now, during the second session of the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, there was a major theme on global reparative justice. And most recently, there was a call from Native Americans for reparations from land-grab universities. Now, what do these milestones tell us? Well, traditionally, reparation has always focused on financial compensations for losses. However, if you take a closer look at this global reparation, maybe / healing movements, there's this kind of a growing recognition that reparation is actually a broader notion beyond mere financial compensations. And in fact, reparation must involve other forms of reparative, restitutive, and restorative practices aimed at promoting healing and preventing dehumanizing act. So these milestones also call for a reconceptualization of reparation. So for instance, we might ask questions like, how should we understand reparation? What are the principles and objectives of reparation following those harrowing historical atrocities and recognizing their continued legacies? Now, how might reparation and healing be implemented in ethical and meaningful ways, especially for the descendant communities? And what are the opportunities and the challenges for reparation, and so on? So to help us explore these questions today, we have two excellent keynote speakers, Professor Ana Lucia Araujo, a historian and author on the theme of reparation. And there's also Louis Cardinal, Canadian Indigenous educator and activist who has dedicated his life to reparative and restorative work. So And Lucia and Louis, I now turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Gill, for inviting me to this webinar. I am a historian, and I am here today because in 2017, I published a book that is titled Reparations for Slavery and the Slave Trade, A Transnational and Comparative History. And the second revised and expanded edition of this book will be out then this year in November. Despite the fact that the book was updated and expanded, the central argument of the book is still the same, meaning that the demands of financial and material reparations have a long history that dates back to several centuries than when the Atlantic slave trade and slavery started. In my previous work, I explored other forms of reparation that had prevailed up to this day, which are symbolic reparations, then through monuments, memorials, and museums. But this book and what I am doing here today is an effort to historicize the demands of reparations for slavery, then the enslavement and slavery of Africans and their descendants in the Americas. There are many ways to define reparations, and some scholars and newcomers sometimes have used a variety of terms, but historically the term reparation has been employed to convey the idea of making amends for past wrongs, and this is a term that became more widely used during the 20th century through international law and in the human rights field to describe the redress then of physical, material, or moral damage inflicted then on an individual, a group of individuals, or even on a nation. Now, in customary international law, reparations were associated with measures to indemnify nations for wartime damages. But these amendments, of course, they contain the two dimensions, the moral or symbolic dimension that usually consists of what you have been seeing, not specifically in this past year, but since the 1990s or even the 1980s, that usually consists of apologies and sometimes actions to help those who are victims of wrongdoing. The second component carries then a financial and material scope, and this means, in other words, that the victims of past wrongs also obtain money or other material resources, such as land, as payment for the misconduct inflicted. Then reparations can carry only the symbolic dimension through recognition of the harm inflicted, apologies, and the symbolic measures that can include the construction of a memorial, a museum, a monument, the creation of plaques, the renaming of buildings, all this to honor the victims of wrongdoing. But reparations can also carry a material and a financial component. And in this recent work, I've been doing both dimensions, but the book on reparations, the book titled Reparations for Slavery, is about the material and the financial dimension. Now, during the era of the gradual abolition of the slavery, then between the end of the 18th century until the second half of the 19th century, a small number of enslaved people demanded that either the government or their older owners to provide them with some kind of compensation, such as pensions or other kinds of financial reparations. In the case of the United States, we have the iconic case of Belinda Sutton, which is an African-born enslaved woman was owned by the wealthy Isaac Royal Jr. Of Massachusetts, who funded the creation of the Harvard University Law School. And Royal Jr. left Massachusetts during the American Revolutionary War. And in his will, he instructed his grandson to pay Belinda Sutton 30 pounds for 3 years. After his death, then 1781, one assumes that Belinda, she was paid the sum indicated in the will, but in 1783, when the payments stopped, she petitioned the Massachusetts legislature and asked a pension as reparations for the unpaid work that she provided for the royals. Then, although only partially successful, her case was the first non-successful case of an individual demanding reparations for slavery that worked it out. Now, these first demands by individuals that emerged then, even during those days when slavery is still existed and was indeed far from being abolished, these cases give us a broader perspective to understand the discourses of the first social actors who engaged in formulating demands of reparations for slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. And they also show us that demands for reparations have this long history, because every time we have this new wave emerging, it looks like it's the first time, but this history is long, and many of the arguments that have been used in the past are being repeated in the present, which is why it's important to know very well this story. Here, then, I don't need to revisit the profits generated by the Atlantic slave trade and slavery, and to explain you all the violence and dehumanization that these atrocities imposed on Black Africans and their descendants transported to the Americas. But still today, the legacies of these atrocities remain alive in the collective memory of the various populations, the descendants of the victims of these complex forms of violence. And this is why in 2023, we are having this kind of webinar around the theme of healing and reparations. Now, the public debates on reparations during the period of emancipation, then starting late 18th century until the 19th century, shed light on how various social actors conceived property rights and how they envision the future of the free populations. Take the example of Brazil, because you have been talking about the different countries, the United States, England, but take the example of Brazil, that in this case, it's an important player. Brazil imported nearly 60 million Africans were sent to Brazil during the era of the Atlantic slave trade, though about 5 million are disembarked alive in Brazil. This is more than 10 times the number of enslaved Africans that were brought to the United States. And Brazil today is the country with the largest population of African descent outside an African country, such as Nigeria, that is the most populous African country. Now, the slave trade from Africa, in the case of Brazil, was banned in 1831, but was never fully enforced at that point. And as a result, just between 1831 and 1850, when another law was enacted and stopped the slave trade to Brazil, nearly 1 million enslaved Africans entered Brazilian ports illegally. And this number alone is 3 times the number of enslaved Africans brought to the United States. Then, as a result, most of these men, women, and children and their descendants were kept illegally enslaved in Brazil until 1888, when Brazil abolished slavery. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery. Now, Brazilian Black abolitionists, of course, they were aware of these crimes during the 1870s and the 1880s. They were among the few activists defending reparations to former enslaved people. Luiz Gama, for example, was one of these activists, and he even calculated the amount due in salaries to slaves in Brazil, and he publicized this amount in newspaper articles. He wrote, now, during the 19th century as well, there were other problems going on in terms of the legality of the institution. The internal slave trade, for example, continued active in countries such as the United States, Brazil, and Cuba. And in this context, many free people, free African Americans and people of African descent, or people who were already emancipated, were unlawfully enslaved or re-enslaved, even beyond national borders in some cases. Now, at this point, although some anti-slavery activists occasionally evoked the need for reparations to former slaves and their descendants through land redistribution, for example, wages, and even education, what prevailed in these public debates was demands for financial compensation for slave owners in the case of the end of slavery. Even the case of Haiti, the only country to at the same time abolish slavery and becoming an independent nation. The case of Haiti, Haiti had to compensate former French slave owners. Then the way this happened is that in 1825, Haiti agreed to pay France 100 million francs in 5 installments in order to allow France to compensate the former colonists. Then to different degrees in all these societies in the Americas, to some extent, former slave owners, they were compensated for the end of slavery. This happened with the abolition in the British colonies, in the French colonies, in Washington, D.C., in the United States, the Dutch colonies as well, and even in Brazil, through the gradual abolition, slave owners were compensated. They were not compensated with the final abolition, but through the gradual abolition, they were. Now, even after slavery ended, either in the British Caribbean or in Cuba, the creation of apprenticeship, then the systems of apprenticeship, they indirectly rewarded former slave owners who kept freed people under their control and by paying them symbolic wages. Now, in the case of the United States, the period then that followed emancipation brought hopes of land redistribution to formerly enslaved people, but these projects, they all failed. Then during the 1890s, when the hopes of land redistribution and the hopes of giving access to civil rights to former enslaved people, then African Americans in the United States, when these hopes were ended, there was an important movement that emerged in the United States at the end of the 19th century, asking pensions to former slaves. And this was a movement then asking then the US Congress to pass bills that would then give the right to former slaves to receive a pension. The leaders of this movement at the time, one of them was a freedwoman called Kelly House. They conceived the payment of pensions as financial redress for the many years that they labored and they were not paid because they were enslaved people. Now, the bills demanding then pensions to ex-slaves generated a lot of debate at the time. They gathered with this movement thousands of individuals, but the federal authorities, they persecuted and prosecuted the leaders of the movement. Some of them were sent to prison, and ultimately they never achieved their goal. And here I'm not talking about the descendants of enslaved people. This was a movement led by formerly enslaved people, then the direct victims of the atrocity. Now, meanwhile, during the 19th century and early 20th centuries, other former slave societies such as Brazil, Cuba, and Colombia did not witness any kind of collective movement demanding reparations for slavery. even if in this cases, then Black populations were then didn't have access to material resources, they still privilege the struggle for citizenship in societies where the ideologies of mestizaje and racial democracy were predominated ultimately. But in the period then that followed the Second World War, this context started changing. This happened especially when then the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust obtained restitutions. And in this new landscape, we had then calls for financial, material, and symbolic reparations re-emerging again and starting receiving public attention for the first time then more broadly in the 20th century. This is after the Second World War. And during the Cold War, then during this period, but more towards the 1960s, in the United States, even though reparations activism was constantly by this time associated, for example, with communism, several groups advocating reparations resurfaced during this period. Then I mentioned here, for example, the Reparations Committee for the Descendants of American Slaves, led by Queen Audley Moore, the movement, the Republic of New Africa, and also the Black Manifesto, authored and disseminated by James Forman, that requested reparations to US churches and synagogues. None of these movements was successful. But as the end of the Cold War approached, the government of the United States indeed awarded financial restitutions to Japanese Americans who were unlawfully interned in camps during the Second World War. And with this precedent, the end of the 1980s and the 1990s provided again a new ground for a renewed wave of demands of reparations for slavery. During this period, also countries such as Brazil, Colombia, and Ecuador enacted new constitutions recognizing the right of land ownership for their Black communities. In Brazil, also during the 1990s, we had a group of Black students organizing petitions demanding reparations. Now, during this period also in the United States, we had new organizations emerging, combining activism and litigation, requesting reparations for slavery, and also sometimes adding the period of segregation to this to their demands. Now, the echoes then of this first or of these movements by the time in the 1990s were heard also in Africa, where we had then a group of intellectuals, artists, politicians, and activists who issued a document calling for reparations for the Atlantic slave trade and colonialism. Now, with the beginning of the 21st century, which is then the past 23 years, the United Nations World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance that was held in Durban in 2001 recognized slavery and the Atlantic slave trade as crimes against humanity. And that same year, France also passed a law recognizing this the slavery and the slave trades as a crime against humanity. Then more than ever, demands of redress acquire new strength. Then in 2014, the CARICOM, Caribbean Community, issued a 10-point plan requesting reparations, then material, financial, and symbolic reparations. And these requests, these demands were addressed then to various European governments, including then the United Kingdom, Spain, France, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, and Portugal. The CARICOM calls for reparation at the time 2014, which is about 10 years ago, received great attention from the media. And a few weeks later, there were several debates going on in the United States. But despite these movements and recurring debates on whether governments and other organizations should award reparations for slavery to the populations of African descent, other questions such as which forms of reparations should take place is still, despite these debates, to this day, no former slave society, then of societies where slavery existed or that were fully based on slavery. Up to this day, no government of these societies paid reparations to the descendants of the slaves and to those who were enslaved at the time. Yet, what we see every year, demands of redress continue to be the object of lawsuits and bills, and also remain present in the public sphere through popular demonstrations, especially in the period approaching then commemorations associated with the abolition of slavery. For example, just a few days ago, we had the Dutch king who addressed an official apology, and this is the first time that a head of state does that. And he addressed this apology for the role of the Netherlands in the Atlantic slave trade and slavery, because Netherlands is now then commemorating the 160th anniversary of emancipation. It's still, despite all these different debates and apologies or alleged apologies, there are many questions that remain unsolved. Which kinds of reparations are due, symbolic, financial, material, or all of them? Even in the case of CARICOM, the 10-point plan sometimes is very vague and insists more on the symbolic component. And also there is no consensus regarding who should pay reparations and who should obtain them. Finally, it's important to have in mind that today demands of reparations for slavery go far beyond the requests of amounts of cash to particular individuals and groups. Instead, we have a variety of groups and even nations that collectively or individually demand financial and material reparations to other groups, sometimes companies as well, and even governments. Then, as never before, there are now groups in the three continents involved in the Atlantic slave trade, creating ties in order to establish possible common grounds to fight for reparations. This wealth of modalities of reparations may sound promising, but also raise other problems in an era of great inequalities in which targeted initiatives will not solve systemic global inequalities, in part derived from the era of Atlantic slavery, slave trade, and colonialism. Then I will stop here and I pass the mic to Lewis. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Araújo. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I will try to follow up that with my perspectives on reparations, particularly coming from a Canadian experience. As was stated earlier, this is a very important discussion topic, not only here in Canada, which is underway in a time of reconciliation, but it's a conversation that involves more than governments, and it's something that we really have to tackle as individuals and as communities. So I want to talk about reparations, restitution, rematriation, reconciliation, and then the fifth R, which I'll talk about at the end. Reparations, when we hear about it on the news or in various rooms of discourse on the internet, there's so much attention, too much attention is being paid by the media on the financial compensations to a certain group of people who have been experiencing various forms of genocide. It's something that I think that really does need to be brought into a context that makes it more personal, makes it more local, makes it more direct. Because when we talk only about money, we are losing sight of the reality of long-term physical and emotional trauma and loss that underscores the reasons for reparation. A lack of understanding leads to the misunderstanding of the legacies provided by documented, evidenced personal, cultural, and economic devastation of a people. We lose sight of what has caused this. It creates further divisions, resentment, and anger in a nation's population and society. And I do hear that here in Canada when Indian residential school payments were paid out to survivors. People were just focused on the money end of the things, but not really understanding the depth of which it has affected our people here. And so we create, by doing that, we create more conflict and separation within our nation. So we have to address that. As a nation, we need to be publicly educated as to why financial compensation is given to one part of the society and not another, especially during times of economic struggle and rising poverty. During these times, of course, people who are struggling with that are raising that question: well, why them and not me? And so it becomes a binary opposition to each other and creates that struggle. A nation needs to be led through or lead itself through a process of reparation, because it is a process, it is a journey, it is an understanding that is a lot more deeper than what we know. So education then becomes a very critical part, an education of the public, an education on the issues, and really providing that depth to understand it. And I think, you know, our artists play a huge role in that, our creators of information and art, by explaining those things. And it's all we know, you know, and as we all know, communities can be measured by what their artists are saying. So we need to go deep is the point that I'm trying to make. And financial reparation is only a part of a bigger and a deeper solution to make a person or people or a community whole. So with financial reparation, that's only one part of the broader aspect of reparations. And the question that often comes up, or the questions that often comes up, is what are these reparations paying for? What are its intentions? What is the value added to financial reparations? And I like to inform people that there's historical and current genocidal traumas expressed through nation and global-wide strategies like colonization, forced assimilation, unfettered capitalism, and as I like to call it, the politics of greed. They've had and continue to have a severe generational consequence. And so if we don't truly address those issues, we will continue to kill, to maim, and to destroy lives and cultures, and continue a national dysfunction and an imbalance. Unaddressed historical wounds, past traumas, will express itself in the most negative of ways, and further creating a discord amongst people within those nation states. And so when we say, well, what have you lost? Well, you know, the loss of language, the loss of culture, identity, that what I call identity dissonance, cannot be downplayed, because knowing who you are is the golden rule around the world. The question of who am I? Who are we? Why am I here? All these questions are really tied to cultural traditions of a nation. The ceremonial and spiritual aspects of the culture is critical in transferring that information and knowledge to the next generation. And if we don't have that, well, all we have to do is look to our what they call social disparity ratios, and how many particularly Indigenous people, in my case, are the walking wounded and the broken, because they don't have access or tie into their ceremonies, into their culture, and even into their traditional communities. So there's that loss, and it's a disconnection from relationship and community. Deep losses are felt. It develops inner hatred, family breakdown, and traditional knowledge loss as well. And when we lose access to land, when we lose access to traditional territory, I call that the great disconnection. Because we know that when we do connect in a cultural way, that ceremonies or other aspects of culture, we have a deep relationship to the land that helps us. So land then becomes a part of that healing process as well. But because of that, severe societal racism, discrimination, prejudice, disease, incarceration, and premature death also creates that inner perspective of being a second-class citizen, or belonging to a second-class status within any nation. And of course, a second-class life is usually followed by a second-class death. So we cannot really underscore the importance of looking at reparations as more than a financial payout, more than trying to erase the past with money. It's a lot deeper. So when I think about reparations, I think about the Canadian experience with reconciliation and reparations and restitution here. I hear a frequent refrain from a lot of people when I explain about the past historical traumas of Indigenous people in particular. They will say things, and I've heard this statement a lot, is, well, I wasn't alive when all this happened. It's not my problem. And then I say, well, the national debt, those billions of dollars that are a national debt, is not my problem either, because I wasn't there when it was created. So I guess I shouldn't pay my taxes. In short, we all have a role to play, and we all have that common debt to correct past historical traumas to any given people, and to take the effort to really understand what has happened in the past. So reparations should be seen as a national debt, or else we'll never have a balance if the debt is not paid or repaid. It becomes a problem of the next generation and the next, and so forth and so on. And we don't have to look very far to realize that looking at history, that if we don't take care of what we can take care of now, it certainly becomes our children and our grandchildren's issues. And it's hard work. It's courageous work as well, but it's necessary if we want to have a life, a community, a nation that espouses peace, friendship, and understanding, and a relationship to all the peoples in its nation state. And so it's not only the responsibility of the national government. Of course, the national government has access to funds and resources that can make things happen. But it's also an individual obligation. It's also a collective obligation. And so that means that not only do I have a personal commitment to understanding more and learning more about what has transgressed other people, I also have a commitment to the community that I'm in, that we can connect together as a community to be able to do the learning and the teachings, to understand what has happened in the past. We need to understand that in order to move forward. So it's just not a national government to government sort of a relationship. It's a person to person, which is really an important way of looking at this. While the financial compensation is necessary to mark what has been lost, it certainly is a part of the broader solution. And so it becomes personal, becomes local, it also becomes national, and in this case, it becomes international as well. So when we talk about restitution, is an attempt to restore something to its origin or original state, to make one whole, not to be confused with replacement. Because replacement then is simply taking something else and replacing it with another. There's a lot more depth to that as well. But restitution It's providing that time, resources, tools, and space, and yes, at times money, to return to culture, return to land, to rights, to governance, and to agreements, both historical and current, in order to really start to develop the healing process within a nation state. There has to be agreements and relationship agreements established, particularly with people who've been marginalized and traumatized by the colonial or unfettered capitalist experience. Restitution from an indigenous perspective is a part of reparation and reconciliation, and it involves land, money, relationships, and control. As a Canadian example, a lot of things have gone missing and or stolen. We have a process here in Canada that's called land claims or special claims, and that's an example of how we can address or redress what has gone missing. And because the evidence is very clear, it then puts the government in a responsibility to address those financially, and also resource as well. Because what has been lost cannot be replaced by others. It has to be replaced by the people who have been involved. And that means that we need to address and settle outstanding legal issues. Providing financial compensation is just one thing, as I said before, but seeking justice is an act of healing. One of the lessons that I've learned in our reconciliations here in Canada, our efforts here, is that we need to address these issues because healing is justice and justice is healing. We have to reach back to those past traumas and address them straight on, because we don't want to leave this to the next generation. The next generation has suffered enough, and those ones who are yet coming should be welcomed into a world that is about inclusivity, respect, and peace. And as a part of that healing process and the restitution process is returning a people's history into its rightful place in a nation state's history. Stories can never be underestimated in terms of their strength and their healing properties. Stories or histories, in this case, are a way in which we remember who we are and we remember where we've come from. And from that, we logically know where we need to go. As a part of restitution is also reclaiming economic self-sufficiency and creating political and legislative space in government and governance. Oftentimes, a lot of conversations don't really talk about how, particularly with Indigenous people, again, is how their economic structures had been totally destroyed. Their sense of self-sufficiency had also been destroyed. So it does create then political and legislative opportunities to create that space within the government and in the process of governance. For Indigenous peoples, as an example, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People is a framework of returning into that state of relationship and relevance with the nation state and all of the people that are in it. So it becomes a very important aspect. The third R that I was mentioning is rematriation. And rematriation from Indigenous ways of knowing and being is about returning to the roots of your culture and identity to achieve health, wellness, and a way of living a good life. We also recognize that the earth is our mother. So hence the name rematriation, returning to the mother, returning to where we have come from, the land bases, connecting with the land in and of itself. Within Indigenous cultures and languages, they've been shaped by the land upon which people have had a deep emotional and spiritual connection for millennia upon millennia, a profound relationship. That deep relationship is also known as the Great Connection, because the opposite of addiction is not abstinence, it is connection, or it is reconnection, connecting not only to the sense of who you are, but the connection to your community, your traditional communities, the connection back to your language, the connection back to your spirit. And the land is critical in how we achieve that, because it's believed that the land is the people and the people are the land. That's why we have difficulty in accepting concepts like land ownership and those sorts of things. Stewardship is another word that we should consider. It can be said, though, when we talk about land and how it's influenced and shaped our cultures, that Indigenous languages are the sounds of the mother. In this case, the sounds of Mother Earth. Her voice speaks through us. And that's why we as Indigenous people find it incumbent upon ourselves to speak for Mother Earth when she is threatened. As a part of that repatriation, a strategy of cultural and language preservation and education is necessary. For example, an official Languages Act for the marginalized and traumatized people is a way, again, of supporting those cultural foundations. Access to cultural programs, especially in urban areas, is a current and very high ranked need. Most Indigenous people, for example, are in urban centers, are in the cities. And here in Canada, we have over 70% of our peoples living in urban centers. In Australia, it's 78%. And I think on average around the world, it's right around 70% as well. But in these urban centers, we don't have easy access to ceremony and ceremonial places in order to practice those important cultural aspects of who we are. And so if we don't have that, what we are experiencing is an urbanization of Indigenous people. And that simply means that there's a loss of that connection to culture and to identity. So rematriating is a return to the embrace of your mother. And while there's a lot of legal language that's wrapped around these concepts, it boils down to a very simple concept that I think all nations of people identify, and that's being in relationship, in a healthy relationship with not only yourself, your culture, and your traditions, but also in relationship to other peoples in the nation state that you might come from. So the reason why that's important is because within the many different peoples around the world, we all have something to offer each other. And so within Indigenous traditions, we always value the stranger, I guess you could say. We always value other people because we know that because they come from different parts of the world, that they have unique knowledges and they need and have a place in the great circle of life. And we need to honor that. So the third R is reconciliation, of course. Reconciliation simply means a return to harmony. Here in Canada in 2008, a formal apology was made by the then Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, and it was immediately followed by the formation of what was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which then led to the creation of 94 calls to action. And of course, that's a great gesture. It's a great step forward. The calls to action really have helped to frame some recovery of traditions, knowledges, and relationship. That's really, really critical. But there's still a lot of work to be done. And there's still a lot more understanding that needs to be created and how to actually implement all of these things. Because reconciliation it's a journey. It's not a destination, it's continuous. And that's why we always have to be vigilant with each other, because it's about healing as a nation. When we acknowledge historical past and we do something about it and we address the issues that need to be addressed, it heals communities, it heals the nation, it heals individuals. And it addresses those forgotten traumas that still undergird a lot of relationships that exist. So it's more than saying sorry. It is, it's about action. We have to be action oriented in what we do. Apologies are not nice, but they really don't mean as much if they're not followed by action. So the core of reconciliation is learning history and re-seeing it, really uncovering history to its deeper depths in terms of what has happened before. So indigenous peoples reclaiming their cultures and identities is that process of seeing ourselves again, reclaiming economic survival and creating new economies, replacing those old ones. But then, like I said before, we're not replacing them with someone else's. We'll create new ones and replace what was old with what we now have to deal with in this day and age. And becoming more versed in understanding of issues and struggles of the dispossessed, and joining them with support really pulls the nations together. And of course, like I said before, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that area. So from my Canadian experience, it's important to understand and honor what we call treaty rights or Indigenous rights. Is very important. Within that is a blueprint for success and full participation within a nation state. Utilizing then people's collective knowledge and wisdom holds many possible solutions for community, social, and individual healing and strengthening. Again, what's important here is that we recognize that while the trauma, while the pain of colonization has affected us very deeply, we also know that it's affected other Canadians. And I do see that same trend within other nations as well, that it wasn't just a negative effect for those who have been marginalized and traumatized, but it also has been a negative effect for those who belong in the part of society that's more favored. And so that's why it becomes very personal. And that's why the personal is very important. The local level, the grassroots, as we like to say, is a really important part of that reconciliation. A very dear friend and mentor of mine, the late and great Elijah Harper, in a discussion with him, and when I asked him about his opinions about this reconciliation announcement back in 2008, he said, you know, governments to governments will always have their conversations. We'll always strive to do the best thing. And oftentimes we don't see the changes that are necessary coming from our governments. It has to come from the people. And so he said, to achieve real reconciliation in this country, the people must sit with one another and talk. It takes that time, but that is an investment of time and relationship that can generate a lot of positivity and healing within any nation state, because reconciliation is generational work. We need to keep moving forward with that as a part of our national psychological furniture, if you like to say that, because it belongs to us all, and it's the people who need to lead the way to change by talking with each other. And so we always have to become vigilant and united in supporting each other, and not being afraid to reach out for questions and questioning our own behavior. To reach out to Indigenous peoples, for example, or the marginalized and traumatized peoples of your nation states, work with them together on social and other issues. And we take that knowledge from the teachings that come from building a garden together. If you have a neighbor, a great way to get to know them is building a garden together and sharing the fruits of that labor. It's so representative of what it is that we can and cannot do. So reconciliation is about putting the relationship back together and charting a new course, because relationships, as we all know, can break down, but it doesn't mean it ends. It just means that we have the opportunity to redefine the relationship, strengthen it, and then chart a new course into the future. So it is important then to understand the past, because as the old adage goes, if you do not understand the past, then you will never fully understand yourself and where you are going. If not, we are doomed to repetition. So an act of reconciliation, reparation, and restitution are acts of bravery, and it includes us all. When the people lead, the leaders follow. which is something that I live by. Because when the people talk, they get together, they identify what it is they're going to do together and how to work together. Our political leaders recognize that, and they will follow. So then that leads, of course, to the fifth R. We have reparations, restitution, rematriation, reconciliation, and then the fifth R is relationship. So thank you very much, and I'm going to hand the opportunity back to our MC.
Thank you very much. May I invite Ana Lucia to come back and join us? Well, beautiful, beautiful presentations. It feels like very comprehensive lectures. Thank you both so much for your very thorough exploration of this topic of reparation. Well, for us, the audience, and myself, we have learned that reparation / healing, this imperative is multifaceted and involves material, immaterial, in symbolic, but also moral, ethical dimensions. And it has to be multi-generational, it sounds like, and it's transnational, because no country can deal with reparation on its own. And we talk about involves access to land, economic system, political processes, public governance, relationships, voices, agencies, you name it. And I love the way that you said, and Louis, when you say, when people lead, the leaders follow. That's really interesting. Now, first, let's just look at as a reparation as a multifaceted, multidimensional concept. Ana Lucia and Louis, could you just reflect on the relational? Of course, reparation will not be healing unless it is also fundamentally about rebuilding relationship, as how you ended. But there is always a risk, and one of the questions highlighted, there's always competing victimhood. People were arguing who deserves what, who deserves more, or other people separating from that, and therefore you recreate divisiveness. Now, so Ana Lucia, in your research, and Louis, in your experience working with indigenous communities worldwide, what are there historical and contemporary examples of how kind of reparation actually contribute to that, the relational enrichment? And just walk us through, if there are such examples, how did that happen?
I would say that it's a difficult question. It's a difficult question. We have individual cases and cases in particular places that in particular times there were measures that we can consider as reparations. If we focus on, for example, the material and financial dimension, then in those places, for example, one good example is the case of Brazil, when the Constitution of 1988 recognized the right to the land to the Black communities that were associated with slavery, the Colombo communities. And after that, there was a second decree that expanded the notion of who were those communities that would have access to land. Then this is an important component, because these communities then were first recognized. Second, they would be able from there to obtain the titles to own that land collectively. And to do so, of course, they had to show this ancestral connection, but at the same time cultivate relations with the communities. And this, of course, worked for the Afro-Brazilian communities, but the indigenous communities in Brazil were connected to this to these Black communities as well. They even in the quilombos that were fugitive communities during the period of slavery, we know that there were in many of the quilombos indigenous communities as well. I would say that this is one example, but it's still then locally with these communities, there was a way of reconnecting and even implement programs of education that would provide the newer generations, younger generations, means to develop reparative justice and also to be educated about the history of their communities. But the problem is that in most cases, of course, there was no reparations. There was no recognition of the harm inflicted. There was no apology. And in the cases when there was apology, and this I'm talking broadly about the Americas, there was no measure to provide some kind of reparations in terms of material and financial reparations. And when this is not on the table, it's very difficult to talk about healing, because in most cases, Black communities in the Americas, they are living in poverty. They don't have access to healthcare, to education, and to all that are elements that is not symbolic. A monument or education will not transform this as magic. Then this material and financial component is important for healing. There is no way of healing if you don't even have access to healthcare, and if you cannot have a job, or after COVID hit, you lost your job because your job was to sell food in the streets, and at the same time, your family, most of those who died during the pandemic were people living in these communities who didn't have access to this basic needs. Then this is where the material and financial reparations hit, because if we do not have that to start, how can people have these exchanges? Then I believe that the richest component in terms of exchanges that occur is really when people are demanding reparations, because when the demands are going on, this is when people, they get together. This is when indigenous communities in the Caribbean and Black communities in the Caribbean got together when CARICOM was demanding reparations. This is when thousands of people in the United States, of free people, got together to demand pensions. Then this is where the healing is difficult to occur. But I think that it's in the process of demanding that we can have some kind of progress.
Yeah, thank you for that, Professor. I agree with everything that you stated. When it comes from when I look at this question from an indigenous perspective, I look at it with something that elders have always taught me, and that is, it's all about relationships. And one of the great crises that we are facing today, as elders have pointed out globally, is that humanity has forgotten how to have relationship, and so it becomes a very relational issue. Having financial compensation, again, is only part of it. We also need legislative and regulatory compensation as well. That means that you fix the process into your legal and social systems in order to create tools, programs, opportunities, particularly for those marginalized, traumatized peoples, to be able to rebuild for themselves who they are as individuals, and how to address the issues. Because a lot of times when good-minded and good-hearted people mean well, but it also can be the road to more conflict, because oftentimes they try to do too much good by forcing ideas and things to address a given issue. there requires a lot of patience outside of courage to do this. But if you invest the time and you create that space for those people to reconnect with tools and opportunities to be themselves, it's really important. And what we're seeing here in Edmonton is one example, is that we've created the first urban Indigenous ceremonial grounds, or designated ceremonial grounds, in Canada. And that means that our peoples don't have to leave the city anymore just to do our basic ceremonies and healing practices. We actually have a place that we can take public transportation to in order to participate in these things. And it was a courageous act, a bold act of reconciliation by the city of Edmonton to build that in relationship with Indigenous people, and they expended $6.5 million to do so. So now it's the first of its kind in Canada, and it's inspiring other cities to do the same thing, because as I pointed out before, over 70% of Indigenous people no longer live in their traditional communities, reservations, First Nations, Métis settlements, villages, and they're in the urban center. So, you know, that's one quick example of what can be done. But just to make a point on it, because I don't want to be wearing rose-colored glasses all the time on these things, it's difficult because the past trauma has also taught the traumatizers how to hold on to those twisted values in terms of relationship with other people. So that's what has to change. But if the process is good, people start to learn and they recognize how their behavior and their previous frames of mind have caused the situation that people find themselves in.
Thank you. Both of you have illustrated with good examples, really interesting. I would go to the systemic in a moment, but because both of you point towards that. But in the meantime, I just want to ask a historian and also the Indigenous elder to think about in many traditional societies, the way that we die, we pass is important, and for lots of souls who departed in ways that is in extreme brutality, that can be a trauma even just for the dead. So we often see in traditional societies, they would say, if we do this, it will allow those departed to have a peaceful departure. So when we talk about relationship, we tend to think of the relationship about us with people from the other side of the community, or the other community who may have perpetuated or participated or sustained that kind of trauma or brutality. But in fact, there's also the history, well, the relationship with historical people who were with us in the past. So in some ways, it connected to the notion of healing. Healing is not just healing our body, have better living conditions, better access to healthcare, but also healing is also healing the wound in the past. In doing so, we almost like change the timeline. So I wondered if you just could look at from a historian's perspective, whether there are traditional comments on that and historical kind of commentaries on that kind of healing as temporal experience. And Louise, you may say a few words on that from the Indigenous people's perspective.
Yeah, I'll start first because it's a brief. Again, I'm going back to that point about it's all about relationships. When we marginalize the people and negate or mitigate or even subjugate their cultural traditions, their languages, their ceremonies, their processes, we certainly are causing further trauma. Particularly when we have a melting pot mentality. and I'm speaking largely about North America, of course, is that you're losing that most important part of what makes us as human beings is is our language, culture, and traditions, because it adds a richness to any nation once they're embraced. So it's very important that we support communities and reconnecting with those traditions. So it's all about relationships in the end. And so this is how we connect then with, as from an Indigenous perspective, connecting with the newcomers to our land and the powers that be.
Ana Lucia?
Yes, I don't know if I can really respond to this question. And of course, it's a broad question. But one element that I would like to emphasize is that in the past years, that one of the main dimensions of the atrocity that the atrocities that were committed during the period of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery is, of course, associated with that. Then for Africans who were first taken from their lands, and many, of course, died, were killed then during the Middle Passage, during the Atlantic crossing, then did not have the right of a decent burial, and a burial that would allow them to remain connected to their homelands, which would have happened if they died within their communities, where the ceremonies, funerals could take days, months, and even one entire year. And once in the Americas, many would die before being sold and were simply be thrown then in places that were not conceived and would not be honored, and pass through the ceremonies and the rituals that they would do if they were in their communities. Then it's a trail of death since the capture in the African continent, transportation to the coast along the Middle Passage, before being sold in the slave markets, and then even in the places where enslaved Africans and their descendants worked, when even if they were, for example, in Catholic societies, even if they were baptized and became Christians, they would not always have access to a Christian burial. Then this is a long sequence of dehumanization that has to do with life and also with death, because these two dimensions are not separate for Africans at that time, and is still today. And one of the elements in terms of healing, I would say, and symbolic reparations that has been happening, and taking then into the Africans and their descendants are taking this into their own hands. Then when you are referring to reparations here, it's self-repair that is going on. Many of these communities, Black communities in Brazil or here in the United States, in the Caribbean, they are uncovering, for example, burial grounds where their ancestors were interred or were left to die. And they are then recovering these sites and recuperating the sites and memorializing the sites in ways that finally pay homage to those who died in conditions that their names were forgotten and that no rituals were properly performed. Then we have examples here in the United States in the African burial ground. We have an important example also in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, in the cemetery of New Blacks. And there are many other cases, but many societies are now doing, and even institutions have been doing, taking this kind of approach, for example, to honor these people who remain basically unnamed during the time that they were alive and after their death. For example, by creating by creating walls of names, then where the names of these individuals are now, men, women, and children are listed. And this became shrines to some extent, places, memorials that people can go now there, the same way that Lewis was mentioning that we have places to perform rituals now in the urban areas. Now we have these memorials paying homage to these men and women and children, and where today communities, they can gather around. And one important element of all this is that the communities themselves decide which kind of site and which kind of device they want to create in order to I would say, to launch this process of healing. Then I really believe that for those who are leading this kind of initiatives, they consider this as a way of reclaiming their past and reclaiming their humanity, and through there achieve some kind of healing.
I want to add to what Ana Lucia was saying. I think she made a brilliant point. The healing aspect of recovering bodies is something that's profound, not only for the families or the communities that are involved, but also with the nation as well. We have two huge issues here. We have a lot of issues, but two of them in regards to this is, one is the retrieval, the location and the retrieval of children that went through the Indian residential school system in Canada. And when the numbers started to come out about lost, forgotten, and hidden grave sites by residential schools or close to residential schools, really shook the whole of Canadian society. To know that there were so many children that were lost in these schools and buried unceremoniously, never allowed those families to properly grieve and to live the rest of their lives wondering what happened to their children. That becomes a very intense process. But also, Canadians were seeing the travesty and the atrocity of what those schools represented to a depth inside themselves that they've never experienced before. And I've witnessed anger from non-Indigenous people learning about this and how incensed they were that it actually happened. But that, while it's painful, becomes the growth and the potential of recovery in relationship. But that is an important part. We have to go through pain in order to understand it, in order to learn from it, and to take things from here. And of course, currently, we haven't found bodies of missing, murdered Indigenous women and young girls. That is something that still is here. And I know the numbers bear out in other Indigenous communities around the world. And again, another unsettled part of ourselves is locating them and bringing them to proper rest. So these things are still here. This is not a historical thing as much as we like to think about it, because the consequences of these things really still reverberate from generation to generation.
Absolutely. Thank you for this very beautiful elaborated response to this very difficult question. Thank you. I just want to end on the systemic, because it's very important to reimagine the global structures, systems, institutions. And Lewis, you're saying healing is justice, and justice is healing. So therefore, a just system, just society is important. And I think President Akufo-Addo, the president of Ghana last year, in his speech during the Accra Reparation Summit, and he stressed the imperative of engaging governance and head of state in the sort of a global reparation movement. The political will is important, and some of the audiences also highlighted the importance of the political will. So, but yeah, in some ways, Lewis, this is a question of how do we shift from the politics of greed to politics of dignity? Yeah. So
yes.
what is needed? How where do we start? When historians often use past examples to offer some kind of pathways, and perhaps you could both just briefly touch upon that.
Yeah, that's again a very broad but powerful question as well. When we think about systems and how systems dominate and control any nation state, and I'm not downgrading systems because we need systems and processes and protocols in order to govern ourselves appropriately and respectfully, or to accomplish great tasks and deeds. Systems are there so that we can function more effectively, or theoretically effectively. But we also have to recognize that systems, as we call systemic racism, that is the infusion of concepts and ideas that really structure how the system will respond to a given situation, to a given set of people. And so that means that the system itself has to also undergo its own analysis of things that work and doesn't work for it. How are they responding to requests? What are the attitudes that are shaping and underscoring the decisions that are being made in systems? A lot of examples are out there, and I think about discrimination and racism. We see that within institutions and governments. But if we don't change the attitude of what sponsors that within the system, then we have systemic racism. And it's another very powerful tool for marginalization and traumatizing other people. So one thing that we have to remind ourselves is that systems are created by human beings. And so it's human beings that can change systems.
And Lucia?
Yes, thank you, Sherto, for this question, and Lewis also for this answer. I believe that the answer is in the communities themselves. I believe that I do not believe that when there was change in the past, it was a change from bottom up, then from bottom down. Then the communities need to be at the forefront of these demands. And perhaps this is one of the problems that we have now. Then sometimes the demands of reparations that are re-emerging at this point, they are not coming from movements all the time. They are not coming all the time from grassroots movements. I think that indigenous communities in the Americas have a long tradition of then fighting for reparations, and by using different tools. African populations of African descent, they have to, but at the same time, all this is not always homogeneous. Then in the United States, it's sure that African Americans have been fighting in ways through their organizations and movements in ways that are much more visible than perhaps other places. But I don't believe that without political mobilization and choosing representatives that are committed with this kind of change, that this is something that would be possible. And I also believe that the piecemeal reparation proposals that we see now, even in different cities, or one individual or one company, all this is important, but I do not believe that we are going to address systemic problems of racism and racial inequalities through this piecemeal approach. And this is why the governments and the state, they need to respond to these demands. But up to this day, it didn't happen. We are seeing these apologies, but a response from the heads of the state are not happening. And perhaps the most important problem here is also the problem of then we are referring to racial inequalities, but social economic inequalities that are bigger than ever. And how in this context, when these inequalities are bigger than ever, we address the problems of reparations for atrocities that have been committed several centuries ago and against which people in the past have already fought. It's not, the point is, we are not doing this for the first time. It has been there several times, and in moments that were crucial moments when there were thousands of people mobilizing for that. And it didn't happen. There was no response. And I think that as historians, perhaps this is the way of thinking, what would be the effective way? But once this could be addressed, I don't believe in reparations with the deep inequalities that are in place today, perhaps more than ever, are addressed as well. And perhaps this is also the way of avoiding the divisions that Lewis and you mentioned when you were referring that who should get what and how much, which has been a problem even in the chat. We see the question and answers. We see this kind of approach that seems to want to prevail all the time, that who gets what and I should get more than someone else, or who are the groups that suffered the most, indigenous populations or Africans were enslaved and brought to the Americas. All these groups, to some extent, they were victimized by these atrocities, and we should approach all of them. Then I know that this is a long rambling, but it's something that we needed to continue to discuss.
Absolutely, and we ran out of time. Keep engaged. Now, it's thank you from me, and may you all have a great summer.